not only for the specific conditions and experiences of what happened in terms of the discovery or rediscovery of a cemetery that actually was well known to have been in that area, but the way in which it was encountered, the way in which the community activated in order to claim some authority over what should happen to the remains of ancestral people, and the way in which it intersected with government policy, with local, policy, and with just the practice in many disciplines across the board, was new. I mean, it was a really remarkable set of conditions, and they were very specific to New York. And so when places like the Shockoe Bottom African Burial Ground became an issue and a dynamic, we worked with Michael Blakey. We consulted with folks who had been involved. I think we even talked to you once or twice. And we worked with Dr. Autumn Rain and some others because we wanted to know what are standard practices and what are unique to the situation that we found ourselves in. So it's the same thing with the East Marshall Street Well Project. The encountering of the remains in that well were actually a little closer to the encountering of the remains in New York City, in that there was a construction project involved. What people in authority chose to do in that moment, the way that they responded to it, which was, you will learn more, I'm not going to go into the history of that, but the decisions that were made in that moment were counter to standard recovery practices. And the period of time in which they were given to even do what they could do was extraordinarily abbreviated. I think it was 2 days, right? And then they were sent off to the Smithsonian and some analysis, and then not until 2020 have those remains actually returned into the care and stewardship of a project that is designed to not only treat them respectfully as individuals, but also to pull them back into what are appropriate professional practices for how to care and conserve and research these remains. And so all of what went into sort of every aspect of understanding what happened in 1994 and what happened over the course of the creation of the East Marshall Street Well Project itself from 2012, really until this moment, has been a unique process, certainly in the larger picture, but and then certainly here in Virginia. And so Daniel and Maggie approached me, and they have done a phenomenal amount of work in order to set up this project. And one of the things was, of course, identifying who are all the people that we want to talk to who have been involved, at various points along the way. So a very long list of people from the 1994 era, from the sort of 2010 to 2012 period to get it started, and then historians and people who could track the. So as we were talking about standard practices for the field of archaeology and anthropology and that kind of thing, there was also the looking back to see what were the standard practices for procurement of bodies for the study of the anatomy for medical purposes. And that, if you all have, I'm always doing this, but if you haven't seen the 1949 horror film called The Body Snatcher with Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, double billing, right? It's situated in Scotland. It's set in a medical school, and it is specifically about this moral dilemma of the medical field in how they procure, how they are able to make advances in science and medicine without the legal right to human bodies. And it was not just a matter of legality, it was also a matter of religion or faith, and the relationship of I guess, divinity to the human body. So there's a whole lot that's packed into that. So enjoy the film. But it's not a bad way to sort of come into this because it intersects class. In Europe, it certainly is class. They would also have said race, although they didn't define it in the same way in Europe. But then in the United States, it becomes an intersection with race and slavery, class, and power. as well. So there were a lot of people who could speak to those things, who were consulted along the way, that became a part of the list of interviewers. So we have done, I think we've done 6 interviews so far. And I think we have 2 more on the books going forward. And we are hoping to get 10 done this year or this academic year, and then build from there. But it has been very interesting because so far I've talked to people who have been involved at sort of each point along the way. The last one was Jody Costi, who's the retired archivist of the university. And she was a young in her career at VCU in 1994 when this took place, and happened to be there because she was curious about what was happening. She said a little appalled at what was happening, and managed to take a few photographs at that time because she had a camera with her, which is, so we have cameras readily available. There's like almost no excuse for not taking pictures now. Back in the day, you had to be very intentional and actually take your camera, make sure you had film, and that you were then going to go and get the film processed into actual photographs that someone could see. So in any event, I think that's a good description of sort of what we consider the significance of recording these histories of people's involvement. Because the other thing is, it's not just a record of the project, it's also a record of these very particular individuals' feelings about having been involved in this project. It's, yes, professional work, but this is powerful stuff that meets people in many personal places, and that's coming out in these things as well.
Daniel, do you want to talk more about preparing the oral history projects and then how the students have been involved?
Sure. So as I mentioned before, Maggie and I were both brought on to assist with the implementation of the vision of the FRC, really around research and memorialization and oral history. We built both of those. But we wanted to do it with care, and I'll sort of give you an example. We started getting training and talking to oral historians, going to some workshops, and there's sort of an older school, more traditional school of oral history that the narrator comes in, they tell their story, and that becomes the property of the institution. They take it, they own it, they literally own copyright to it. And sometimes the narrator has no more access to that story than members of the general public. It can vanish. And that was kind of crazy and unacceptable. We did not want to be doing this sort of reparative work with such an extractive mindset, particularly because we're starting with the FRC and votes associated with the East Marshall Street Wealth Project. But there was a request to expand this to interrogate broader legacies of medicine and race in Richmond. And so to go to the community and say, we're going to take your stories was just kind of a non-starter. So that, things took a little time. We started exploring other options, talking to other partners and figuring out new ways to structure narrator agreements that would give them copyright. And, it's not impossible. It just took a little creativity and a little understanding from some new partners. But I think that's something that doing this work is easy to get started. And then you start getting confronted with questions like this that are sort of specific that you might not have thought about when you started, but really become important for doing this work the right way. And one of those also was bringing in Anna, because Maggie and I knew that we're only here for 2 years on this project. There's no way that we had the depth of experience to have these conversations. So finding someone who did was a major priority as well. The last part, as I'll turn it over, was to bring students into this work as well. And I was kind of shocked when I came on board that students had not been brought into the work in any sort of systematic way. And students really are stakeholders in this. This is their university, and they should have some say in how the story is told and what the university undertakes in terms of reparative actions. Well, my power is pretty limited, but I did have the power to start bringing students into my work. And so one of the things we're doing is bringing students in to work with Anna and process some of the oral history interviews, but also giving them training to do their own oral history interviews with their peers, with recent alumni, to capture these experiences, and hopefully have this sort of snowballing effect of students talking to students and building momentum. Because when we talk to students initially, they sort of heard of this, but not really. And that was also kind of shocking. This is such a important part of this university's history, to make students really aware that the place they go to school was important. So I could talk for a lot longer. I don't want to. I would much rather spotlight two of our students and the work they are doing in memorialization and research, which is related to oral history, but also much broader. They're doing a variety of other projects, and you'll hear about them now.
Thank you, Dr. Sunshine. I really do want to emphasize the thing that you just said about keeping momentum for the project. When I entered VCU, I really did not know anything about VCU's history of medical racism or how we're implementing plans like today with the East Marshall Street Well Project. So it was very eye-opening to learn some of the history of the school. It certainly shaped my experience as a student here. It made me rethink how I want to define being a student at VCU with such a history. Over the course of the past year and a half, as a fellow with this lab, I was tasked to educate myself about the history of the East Marshall Street Well Project and then get started on these initiatives that we're about to talk about. And I remember while I was learning about the history of the well, I felt very frustrated and honestly disgusted at the history of VCU. But as I learned more, I also felt more empowered and more inspired, because I think as a student at VCU, it's one of my primary duties to not only educate myself, but to help others become educated as well. And to use my the skills that I've gained at this lab and also all my resources to put back something positive in the community. And for me, that was working on the East Marshall Street Well Project. Going back into the oral history project that the fellows are a part of, we've touched on it a little bit, but essentially what Olivia and I have been working on is recording, transcribing, and editing audio. This is, of course, in part with collaborating with Professor Edwards. We have been working on editing some of the audio that she has produced from her interviews, and then we have also recorded our own interviews with some of our peers at VCU. For example, I am working on interviewing a graduate student in forensic science department at VCU, who's currently working on some of the DNA and forensic science aspects of the project, which I'm not familiar with. I come from a business and law background, so forensic science is entirely new to me. And I think that was also one of the really cool parts of this project. I got to see a lot of different fields with just how interdisciplinary the project is. Yeah, I got to meet people that I wouldn't normally talk to. I got to see different aspects of this project and different disciplines that I really had no idea about. And yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, so building off of what Ron was talking about, as fellows in the lab, we have a lot of responsibilities, both to educate ourselves and to try and educate our community as well. And obviously being in the Humanities Research Center and in the Health Humanities Lab, also part of what we do is research. And like what Dr. Jones was talking about, research in this kind of environment is a bit tricky, because obviously the people that we're talking about, the stories that we're talking about, they have been victims of research. They have been a part of the research process the same way that, dissection material is part of the process, or the same way that experimentation is part of the process. They were material to be used, and that was it. And so it's a bit difficult for us to balance the need to be inquisitive and to be curious, but also to be respectful and to be empowering of these stories, and not to re-victimize them by looking at them as objective material or numbers on a page, right? So that's part of what we're doing, is presenting this at national conferences and things like that, but also just educating ourselves just on a human level about the importance of this project and why we're doing what we're doing.
Do you want to talk more about the initiatives?
Dr. Simpson, did you want me to talk about the initiative? Sure. Okay. So I'm working with Dr. Sunshine on a collaborative initiative. We, like Maggie was talking about, there were an abundance of people who were found in the well, an abundance of remains found in the well, and it is difficult at this moment to ascertain how they got there or how many exactly people were there. So one of the initiatives that I'm working on with Dr. Sunshine is about 3 people. One of them is an unnamed African-American woman who we believe is from Virginia. The other is a young man who was around 19, his name was Giles. And the other is a man who was in a penitentiary, his name was Moses Johnson. Giles and Moses were both executed by the state of Virginia for what was considered violent crimes. They contested those crimes and said that they did not commit them, but of course, that doesn't exactly matter in the state that they were in. So they were both executed and their remains were taken. We believe also possibly experimented on or dissected, and parts of their remains were taken from Virginia all the way up to Massachusetts, where Harvard is. And so we're trying to ascertain how they got there, and also trying to collaborate with people at Harvard to hopefully bring them back and hopefully learn some more about them, because their stories were told basically in a clipping in a newspaper about a criminal who was executed, and that was about it. So we're hoping to learn more about them as well.
And I'm gonna go into a little bit of one of the other initiatives that we're working on, which is the second one that you guys see. The Policy for Human Remains. So all of the initiatives were born out of various recommendations that the FRC, the Family Representative Council, published several years ago. And this initiative was born out of the recommendation to develop formal guidelines for university action, which centered community engagement in the event of future discovery of human remains or material culture. So for this initiative, the fellows have a couple of jobs. One of them is to read up on relevant policies that VCU already has, to see how we can kind of develop a policy that fits around some of the things that we already have and what to adjust. We also read sections of the Code of Virginia, as well as documents from the Department of Historic Resources. All of these help us figure out a way to structure a policy or a policy brief that can help us with this initiative. We also support in writing and revising policy, and we use the enact framework. If you guys are familiar, it's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was published in 1990, I believe. And it's basically a federal law that protects and returns land to Native Americans that were taken from them. So you can probably tell that this would be a pretty powerful framework that we could follow. Yes, and we also, most importantly, I suppose, we collaborate with community and university stakeholders to find a way to recommend university actions that are legally compliant and, more importantly, center community engagement. Because as the general theme of today has been, these projects are not for the community, but with the community, right? And we have a couple things in process for this initiative. There's 3 main points that I want to touch on. The first thing is we want to center the policy around a statement of values. And this, again, goes back to the NAGPRO framework because that's kind of how they follow it as well. We're also planning on developing a training for individuals who have to interact with human remains. And finally, we're also planning on developing an advisory group. This ideally would be made up of individuals from a lot of different disciplines. So we make sure we develop a solution that has a holistic approach to make sure that we get everything right, I suppose. Yeah.
Can I say?
Yeah.
Real quick point.
Yeah.
So, Olivia mentioned we're working together on a project, and Olivia is designing a podcast, which I hope will be available very soon. Love for you all to listen to it about this story. But there's a couple sort of quick takeaways that are heavy, but I think highlight the importance of doing this work, why it matters. So most of the victims of medical grave robbing are anonymous, deliberately. This is something that was done, usually engaging the criminal underworld to steal these bodies by cover of night. It did not take records. There's one case we're working with. There are records only because this medical professor, Jeffries Wyman, was in Richmond for 5 years. And at the end of his 5 years, he got a job at Harvard. And so he took some human remains with him. And because he was moving, he labeled them. And that's the only reason why we know about these people. There's so many ways to go from here. One of them, Joe mentioned, some of these people were not buried, and this is burial for the first time. This is the case for these two men. One was executed in the penitentiary. MCV was the official kind of hospital of the penitentiary, and his body was given to MCV very quietly, but not too hard if you look to see what's going on. Both these men were executed by the state. And as I said, it's kind of just by mere happenstance we know these two end up as cadavers in MCV's dissection room. But you can look at how many people were executed by the state of Virginia. There's a lot of Black men. I happened to find 2 in 3 years, and I know that they ended up at MCV. And I look at that list and wonder how many others on this list ended up at MCV, and I have to think it's most of them, which really changes the way we think about criminal justice in Virginia. The last part, I'll say, this is an American story. This is not a Virginia story. This doctor that I mentioned, he lived all of his life in Massachusetts, except 5 years here in Virginia. He was anti-slavery, funnily enough. This is before the Civil War. Virginia was kind of a backwards place. That did not stop him from using Black Virginians' bodies to make arguments about race, and uncritically sort of picking up these men who, as Olivia mentioned, were accused of these violent crimes, completely devoid of the societal context in which these violent acts were committed, just self-defense, acts of resistance. One of their skulls was used and displayed at Harvard for years with this placard, Moses Johnson, the mind of a criminal. And this is making an argument that he is inherently criminal because of his race, not because of the societal context he was placed in, not for an act of resistance. And so thinking about this as a national story where, Northerners, where Harvard doctors are looking at this and saying, okay, well, this is the Black race. That's one of the many things we're trying to tell in the podcast. Thanks.
So before we go to question and answer, I just want to provide a little bit of context, which we're kind of hinting at, but some of the structures that we have sort of put into place, I think are helpful to call out, to think about how to leverage university resources to support projects like this. And so the students mentioned the Humanities Research Center, which is a university research center on campus. And from that, Chris Shin, professor in women, gender, and sexuality studies, started the Health Humanities Lab. And so we're using the framework of the lab to create really a funding structure, but also a collaboration community of people so that we're able to pay all of the student fellows who are working on this project. In addition to a stipend, they also are receiving a graduation credit that's required by VCU called a real credit. That's like a real experiential learning course. And so they also get that as well. And so we really want to be paying people for their research time as well. And I think that's an important part of this project. We also were able to successfully apply for a vertically integrated project grant from the Office of the Provost and the OVPRI, the Office of the Vice President for Research and Innovation. Ooh, acronyms. And so thinking about how can we leverage the resources that we have at these institutions, I think is a really important question when we think about community engaged work. Well, Brandon Legan. And so that's been a part of this process too. As Daniel mentioned, we are postdocs who are only here for 2 years. And so we don't want to leave VCU with institutional knowledge that's not shared with other people. So we want to make sure that everything we're doing, we're kind of erasing ourselves out of it. We want to create structures that last, that are sustainable, and that people can continue the work or change directions if the work is no longer the way that it should be going. So that's definitely been something we're considering as we build out these projects. And that's been a part of these other initiatives too. Again, these all tie back to recommendations from the Family Representative Council, but are really thinking about how can we share this story. And part of its conferences, we have that set of panels that I shared at the beginning, this set of panels that are also in sort of pull-up form. So other fellows, other student fellows are creating a traveling exhibition of these panels. And so they're installing the Valentine in June, which is really exciting. We just ordered a second set and they'll be programming them in different community spaces. So they're doing really incredible work thinking about community engagement. Rob talked about the policy for human remains, which currently does not exist at a university level. But we're also programming an exhibit. We want to update our website. We're going to share these podcasts, thinking about developing a walking tour. as well as a teach-in, which will be held on April 27th. So there's a lot of work there's a lot of tentacles, I'd say, to this project, but I think it's helpful to figure out how can we create a roadmap that also leaves us out of the picture and allows other people to find their way through this work. So I'm gonna pass it down. Does anyone have any other comments before we open up for questions?
One thing, just to, because I think it was, Hope mentioned the NACRA, that law, and you're correct, it was end of 1991, where that went into effect. That was the Native American Heritage Protection and Repatriation Act, whereby ancestral remains, funerary artifacts, and things of that nature, only for those tribal groups that are federally recognized, those things should be returned from institutions like ours. We're working on our NACRA repatriation now. So that was back in the early 90s. And only now, as they're really, you can imagine, scholars, a lot of pushback to that, but now there's a momentum gaining, and there's actually a new version that was recently passed. So there's a new NACRA. But I bring that up because there is nothing comparable for African American remains when they're found in these contexts, and so there's been some attempts made, to try to develop that, some type of framework, legal framework, but this work, there is no legal basis to require, the return or proper memorialization or burial of these remains for African Americans. And so you have to have a process like this, one that is iterative and one that is from site to site, case by case, built through community consultation, through community engagement, in which you find those individuals who will come to represent those groups. There are no comparisons to be made to a tribal council, for example, who can speak on behalf of a federally recognized group. And so until such time as those things are in place, however difficult it might be to build, given that we are not, our community is not structured, in that way. Until such time as something like that might be developed, we rely on, the ethical framework. And so for those who are not familiar, I just wanted to kind of point out that probably the most useful tool that we have out there now has been developed by the National Historic Trust and Montpelier, the work of the Montpelier Descendants Committee. That is a rubric that they've developed that institutions can use to evaluate themselves, and kind of rank themselves, grade themselves, and move towards proper community or descendant community engagement. So that's something that we use here. Our lab, Institute for Social Biology, use it on several projects. But yeah, I thought that was worth mentioning that there are no federal, no legal protections. So it's the ethics that really drives this. And only in the last few years, some of you may have been familiar with the move, what happened with the remains of the people that were bombed, the move organizations. If you're not familiar with, maybe it's a simplification, but kind of similar to the Black Panther organization. But at any rate, they actually bombed the city building with members of the new organization in Philadelphia. Sometime. This is, I don't know if you remember, it was the 80s, I want to say 85, yes. And those remains found their way to the University of Pennsylvania and were used completely unbeknownst to the family, including the Africa families. We know that that's the surname, the Africa family. We know that their children were used, young children's remains were used for online tutorials and teaching, so forth, completely unbeknownst to the family. And so when that came out, that really became the impetus for a lot of this kind of more ethical development of an ethical framework around skeletal remains. So I'm glad to say it's not been without bumps in the road. This process is easy to kind of gloss over some of those, and happy to speak to those as well. But I am happy to say that this process, once Professor UC put that documentary out, really was at the forefront. It was ahead of some of these changes that we're only now seeing again because of just how egregious that those acts were with the remains of the African family there. And so yeah, so I just wanted to kind of give that context. Yeah.
Does anyone else thank you all so much. That was incredible. So I'm just putting up contact information, but we do have a little bit more time, a little extra time, 20 minutes for Q&A. We just want to thank everyone for participating. We'll just do a round of applause. And we're excited to hear from you. So any questions?
You said you only had identifying information for those two bodies because the man had moved to Harvard or whatever. Is it possible to get DNA from the skeletal remains and compare that to like a 23andMe database? And if that is possible, is that something that you would even be interested in doing to identify, you know, the family members?
Yeah,
Or
maybe
let people know.
I can say briefly the historical context, and then Joe's far more equipped to cut next. So that story it's either a parallel story or an offshoot of our story. As I said, these records were not well kept. These men, one of them was executed around the time we think that the East Marshall Street well was first being used as a place to dispose of human remains. And it was only his cranium that was taken. So his remains, the rest of them are in Richmond. They might be in the well. They might be, they might have been, the well's not fully excavated. So it might be the bottom of the well, it might have been taken out of the well and are now in VCU possession, or they could be in somewhere else. And so one of the things we're trying to do, as you mentioned, through genetics, could be explore that, but that is really a question for the members.
Yeah, sure. So that has been that was one of the recommendations around the genetics was for, and so we're doing basically is kind of extending the East Marshall Street will remain that kind of framework to include these other initiatives that Deb and Maggie and their team have been working on. And so our recommendations suggested the use of DNA analysis, and this also was not unanimous. There were some members, as I mentioned, you know, kind of there were bumps in the road, and part of our deliberation was around whether any such invasive analysis, because it does require further desecration. There's no way around that. So the short answer is that yes, you likely could get some of those answers this way. The DNA is not a magic bullet. We're really, I know we're all kind of inundated with these commercials and everything, and you know, however, looking for family relationships is where you're likely to get some of the strongest and most conclusive findings. So the short answer is that yes, it's likely could happen. These remains actually probably even more likely that you would find out with the remains that they're looking at, as opposed to the East Marshall Street well, which were submerged for many years in water deterioration due to them having been submerged for so long. Meant that some of the individuals that we looked at, we were not able to get good DNA profiles. In this case, with the individuals that likely have been out of that context, you know, for all this time, you probably could find those hits in. But then you get into a whole other host of questions around the ethics. Do you want to engage and have them put into a, you know, large database like this? There are questions that come up around ethics of kind of genetic discrimination, and you know, we have to put all sorts of protections in place for potential family members that you find, because then you get into things, medical insurance discrimination, all sorts of other things. You know, you want to end up in someone's forensic database or so forth and stuff. So it's really complicated, but this is something that we also looked into for the FRC. We did want to search and see whether or not we could find linkages between the ancestral remains from the well and living people today. Of course, with the idea that any living individual should have the final say over the disposition of those remains. But that is an ongoing initiative.
I'm curious about the design of the memorial. Do you have a strategy or a plan for how to go about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I focus mainly on the research implementation work group, and was somewhat aware of what's going on with the memorialization side. We do, as Maggie mentioned, the Dooley Arch, you know, is the area where we're currently looking at. We actually initially recommended reburial and memorialization at the African burial ground in Richmond. Apparently, that you know, the floodplain may be problematic in that regard, so we looked elsewhere. And with the Dooley Arch, there are currently there are groups. Well, I should back up and say that we very intentionally made our recommendations broad. so that we could bring in the proper expertise, for memorialization. So things like design, we really thought that we need to leave that up to the architects and those and people with experience, especially, and perhaps even including some of the African American, African sports sites where they've done memorialization. So we did go and look at the African Burial Ground in New York for some inspiration. But really, those things are we're still somewhat early in that process. But we're leaving that up to those people who are more creative than we are, and those to kind of bring to us. We do know that certain elements we'll want. We do want it to be an open area where people can come in and can deliberate. We want to be a contemplative space, even as it is on the PCU Health Medical Campus site. And the big question that we wrestle with is, how do we balance the fact that this is an academic campus, but it's also a sacred site. We did not mention that there are likely individuals who are still buried under that building. There were 10 feet of the well, approximately, that was not excavated. And so there's every likelihood that there were still other more remains there that we would not be able to, to access. Again, given the rapid nature, they had 2 days, to clear out that site and those remains. And so there are elements of design that we want to incorporate. How to make this a safer space, even as it is an active campus and things of that nature. We ask them to balance, but we're waiting on designs for to embed those.
Thank you. So I'm from Richmond. My family's been in Richmond at least since 1860. That's as far back as I can go. My name is Doreen Fleming. And so I've always felt like, there could be a highly likelihood that some of my family is converted under the highway or perhaps even other projects as well. But my question is, did the Smithsonian, all of that time when it was there at the Smithsonian, did they do anything? They were just in storage there? That's my first question. And then I was really intrigued by the idea of the real credit that's required before graduation. And the student mentioned that, I had no idea about this. Well, what would it take for every incoming student at VCU to be required to watch like Until the Well Runs Dry, that film, as part of their freshman orientation on at VCU and also on the medical field?
I'm so glad you asked.
So I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I think that's.
Thank you. So, oh my God, so many questions. Okay, the real credit is a graduation requirement. Student could speak to that more. You're applying the real credit for this? Do you want to
So that's an optional thing. It should be required.
It's required. So the real credit is required. They started it in the fall of 2021, which was my first semester at VCU actually. So every student has to graduate with real credit, which is basically like a class that involves some sort of like community involvement or like real world application to their studies. And being a fellow at the lab, because we have like real world applications to it, I get real credit for it. Now, going back to your question of making like a class about the history of medical racism or racism in Richmond, like a mandatory part of the curriculum for students. I believe that there is some sort of curriculum that's being developed for medical students, like in the medical school of VCU, but there isn't anything like mandated per se for freshmen or like undergraduates at VCU.
So the question is, what would it take to make that happen?
Yes.
I can add like very briefly to that. So we have what's called like a common book at VCU. And so that's something that is like required for like all freshmen at VCU to read in like their freshman introductory. They don't like to call it an English class, but it's like an English class. It's a freshman introductory class and we have to read that. Our common book last year was a book called The Organ Thieves by Chip Jones. And it wasn't about this, but it was also about an incident of medical grave robbing that happened at VCU's medical campus. But this one happened in the 1960s about, and it was with a different man named Bruce Tucker, whose heart was stolen from him and transplanted into a wealthy white man. Some of you might have heard of the story, but so we did read a book about that and that was mandatory. But that also happened after a lot of campaigning and a lot of really hard work from a lot of like very talented people who were asking that this book be recommended for a comic book and things like that. So that I think would probably take quite a bit of time. We are also working on a health humanities minor, which is also kind of adjacent to what you were talking about, having that be like more of a curriculum. But that's also in development as well. So I guess the answer to your question is a lot of work would be required to make this more institutional.
I would add to the, on the med school side, so part of this is, one of the recommendations from the FRC is to include learning about this before the first anatomy class. And so we're working with people who do orientation for all med students to ensure that they learn about it then. It's such a deluge of information that we don't want that to be the only time that they learn about this. So we're also working with the anatomy faculty. They already teach a class called The Humanity of the Cadaver. So it's just adding a bit more content. And then they already have a ceremony to honor the donors. So it's just a matter of adding a little bit of silence for those who did not consent to share their bodies. And so it's an easy lift in some ways. And yet, yeah, you wonder about the timeline. I know that the conference theme is taking our time, and we want that to be in sort of the opposite direction, not on the institutional side. But yes, I think that would be great. The other component I would say is the racial literacy requirement. Do you want to talk about that, Anna?
Yeah. The university agreed 2 years ago to create a racial literacy requirement for all incoming students to the university. It's underway. It started with a course. The first course to be approved for that was called The Introduction to Race and Racism in the United States. And that's been taught for the last 2 years, but it hasn't made it to required status yet. That should happen this coming fall. But in order to do that, one class, as many teachers as we might have in African American Studies, or also in the American Studies department, because they have a course called Reading Race, more were needed. So from across the university, there have been proposals vetted for new courses that will come online starting in the fall. And there were 32 submissions, so really from across the campus. And currently considering, I think 9 may have sort of made it through this initial process that you can expect to see on the books for the fall semester. But it has been a journey. And new courses have to go through curriculum committee reviews. And they have to be approved by the board of the board of trustees. And so there are definitely hoops that have to be gone through in order to add something to the curriculum, because, and especially if you make it a requirement, it often means significant adjustments to majors, specific requirements. And so they have to sort of weigh those components to it. But there is, I will say, at the student and the faculty level, and to a degree to the administrative level, there is a commitment to making racial literacy a requirement in the university, because we live in a nation that was built with race as one of its fundamental components, and to leave that up to arbitrary learning and incidental experiences is actually not practical, and in many ways not sensible for anyone who is going to function in any discipline as adults in society. So we're
Story of malpractice.
yeah.
So Professor Edwards teaches those classes.
Are we on Zoom?
Yeah, I think so.
Should I talk into the?
Oh, yeah, that would definitely.
Yeah.
No. I feel like I'm in some sort of a bubble with VCU right now. So, because I heard you say well, let's start with your last statement that where VCU will have a required racial literacy course. And then you gave this beautiful rationale for that. We're not in a timeline now where that kind of rationale is accepted. And so the fact that you're doing that, so my question is about how does structural change happen at VCU, and how can you come and teach others, let's say University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where the state legislature is requiring, proposing curriculum. you want to talk about this beautiful centuries-old process of how curricula gets established. Just saying. So, yeah, I really am impressed with the structural change. The other thing I heard you say, wonderful moderator, you are, that every Confederate memorial on your campus has been removed except one, and that one is going to be the new site of a memorial for this reparative process. Please, please tell us what you are doing at VCU and how we can replicate that kind of structural change at other universities in the South.
I have to say, it is horrifying to me to be a model because I see the institutional failures. And when this is the best that it is, I find it really upsetting. But there are some good things about this project. And I think a lot of it is the people who've been committed to doing this work since 94, since 2013, the members of the FRC who have been doing this on a volunteer basis for 10 years, which astounds me. So I think part of this is the commitment that you have, the long-term commitment that you have from people who have been a part of this work. But do you want to talk about institutional struggles?
So how do you make structural change? I mean, it's like, yeah, right. One thing is you have to understand the situation that you are in, the particular situation. So it was one of the reasons why I emphasized that the New York African Burial Ground and how it evolved its journey from absolute desecration to now a national memorial and all of that was entirely different than any other project relating to a cemetery. Each one has very specific things that they come up against. And so the structure of the system. So you have to know what it is, that you're dealing with. The other thing about a university, and all university communities have this at their disposal as an opportunity, and that is their students. Students typically have to learn what power they hold, right? You don't come to the school, they don't have tuition money, they start cutting programs, their accreditation goes down. I mean, there's real concrete power that students have, and so student voices in demanding these things. The racial literacy course and requirement is an initiative of students, then working with faculty because they're a part of the system to make it happen, right? So it really is about really understanding who you are, what power you have, organizing the implementation of it and making it happen. And I know that's generic, right? But so ours is one example of that. And of course, we're still in it. And many of these, in fact, folks involved with the New York African Burial Ground will tell you that they're still in it to ensure that it continues to do what was intended for it to do. And I think the other thing that I would say is remember when you are holding cards, we are still, no matter what these few states are doing or trying to do, they still haven't actually succeeded. The one thing they have succeeded in doing is creating environments of fear where people are then afraid to act or afraid to believe that they actually do hold the cards, right? So trust that you are actually in spaces where you can continue to assert the voice, assert the right idea, or I don't even want to say that, right idea doesn't sound right, that sounds totally subjective, sorry. But in any event, just know that you have more strength than you think you do, you have more substance than you may think you do, and hold fast.
I really want to that. But I think, oh, okay, we have 1 minute, but I just want to hear your question.
Thank you. I don't know if it's more so a question as a comment. When you were mentioning about using incarcerated people for experiments, I've heard my parents say before, St. Philip's Hospital was the Black hospital for MCD, and that it was rumored that a lot of times people were afraid to, or they would tell you to stay away from that area at night because people were disappearing and they didn't know what happened to them. And I assumed that a lot of it was this research going on. And that takes me to the point of Henrietta Lacks in Baltimore. How her body was used, her cells were used for the cancer. And her family just recently, well, in the past few years, found it was her body being used. So I think that's not just the incarcerated people, but probably people of color, specifically Black people, that disappeared and their bodies were probably being used.
I think that's the perfect reflection of that this is a systemic issue and it needs systemic responses. And I think, as Anna was sharing, when we first talked about this with students, the response was VCU should do something. And then we realized we're VCU. And so everything that we do is changing the narrative. And I think that's how we have to act. So thank you all for joining us. We'll hang out.